The night Margot Finch walked into the Harcastle fundraiser, she was already 3 kinds of wrong. Wrong shoes, the left heel had a hairline crack she'd sealed with nail polish and a prayer. Wrong dress, a navy blue wrap she'd bought secondhand from a consignment rack on Delancey Street, steam-ironed twice to pretend it had never belonged to someone else. And wrong family, which was the kind of wrong that couldn't be fixed with nail polish or a steam iron. Her stepsister Vivienne had made sure everyone in the room knew it within the first 15 minutes. "You actually came," Vivienne had said. Not a question when Margot walked through the carved oak doors of the Harcastle Hotel's grand ballroom. It was the kind of building that made you feel your own smallness before you'd even crossed the threshold. 40-foot ceilings, chandeliers that cost more than Margot's entire apartment building, and a crowd dressed in the kind of money that didn't need to announce itself. Vivienne had been standing near the entry with 2 of her friends, a glass of champagne already in hand, looking like she'd been poured into her emerald gown by someone who knew exactly what they were doing. She always looked like that. That was the thing about Vivienne. She was built for rooms like this. Margot was built for spreadsheets at 2 in the morning and coffee that had gone cold. "Dad asked me to come," Margot said. She kept her voice flat. She'd learned a long time ago that matching Vivienne's energy was a losing game. "Dad asks a lot of things," Vivienne said pleasantly, and turned just slightly so that her friends could see her face when she added, "I just didn't think you'd actually show up looking like." She gestured at Margot, with her champagne flute, a small, elegant sweep that somehow managed to take in the dress, the shoes, the hair Margot had pinned up in the elevator, because she'd run out of time like that. One of the friends laughed, not loudly, just enough. Margot looked at Vivienne for a moment. Then she looked past her into the ballroom, at the tables draped in white linen, and the waitstaff moving through the crowd with silver trays and the string quartet in the far corner playing something Margot didn't know the name of. "It was nice to see you," she said, and walked away. She found her father at a table near the east wall, already in conversation with 2 men she didn't recognize. Franklin Finch looked the way he always looked at events like this, slightly too eager, his jacket slightly too new, the laugh he was using for the men across from him slightly too loud. He'd been trying to belong to rooms like this for 30 years. He hadn't managed it yet. He saw her and waved her over with real warmth. That was the complicated thing about her father. He genuinely loved her. He was also the reason she was here. "Margot." He kissed her cheek. He smelled like the same cologne he'd worn since she was 8. "You look wonderful." She didn't correct him. The dinner was long. The speeches were longer. Margot sat through the appetizer and the salad course and half the entree, listening to the table's conversation wash over her and making the appropriate sounds at the appropriate intervals. She was good at that. She was good at a lot of things that didn't show. She excused herself just after 9 and found her way to the side corridor that led to the hotel bar, because she needed a glass of water that wasn't being poured for her by someone waiting to be tipped, and she needed 3 minutes where no one in the room knew where she was. The corridor was quiet. The carpet was the color of red wine in low light. Margot stood near the window at the far end and pressed her fingers against the cold glass and looked out at the city below. The gridded yellow lights, the streams of traffic, the ordinary indifferent machinery of 8 million people not thinking about her at all, and let herself breathe. She heard the footsteps before she turned. He was coming from the other end of the corridor, tall, taller than she'd registered at first, with the kind of stillness that didn't match the pace of the party behind him. Dark suit, no tie, the collar of his shirt open at the throat. He moved like someone who had learned a long time ago that the room adjusted to him, not the other way around. There was a scar along his jawline, thin and silver, that caught the light as he passed under the wall sconce. He stopped when he reached the window, not at the window next to her, at the same window. He stood perhaps 2 feet away from her and looked out at the same grid of lights and said nothing. Margot waited. When he still said nothing, she said, "You're going to tell me this is a private corridor?" "No." His voice was low and unhurried. "I'm going to tell you there's a better view from the north side. I don't need a better view. I needed to get out of that room. He still wasn't looking at her. Who are you hiding from? She considered lying. It would have been easy. My stepsister. She say something. She implied something with a champagne glass. Something shifted in his profile. Not quite a smile. Those are worse. Yes, Margot agreed. They are. They stood in silence for a while. It wasn't the uncomfortable kind. Outside, a bus crossed the intersection 8 floors below, and its headlight swept the building across the street and vanished. Margot's reflection floated faintly in the glass. The second-hand dress, the pinned-up hair, the face she'd stopped appraising in mirrors sometime around her 26th birthday, when she'd decided that particular habit was costing her more than it was giving her. Finch, he said. Not a question. He was still looking at the window. She turned her head. I'm sorry, your father, Franklin Finch. He said it the way someone names a thing they've already catalogued. You look like him around the eyes. You know my father. I know who he is. There was a distinction there that she noticed but didn't press. And who are you? He turned then. The full weight of his attention settled on her, and it was not comfortable exactly. He had grey eyes, very pale, the kind that registered things without appearing to react to them. He was probably 40, maybe a few years past it. There were lines around his eyes and at the corners of his mouth that weren't from smiling. Cade, he said. Just the one name. She waited. He didn't add anything. Just Cade. Tonight, yes. She looked at him for a moment. There was something in his stillness that she couldn't quite name, not the stillness of someone who was bored, or someone who was anxious, but something more deliberate than either. Like a man who had learned that the less he moved, the more other people revealed themselves. Okay, she said. Just Cade. He almost smiled. It didn't quite reach. She went back to the ballroom. She didn't see him again that night, and she told herself that was fine, and she mostly believed it. Her father called her 3 days later. She was at her kitchen table with her second coffee and a spreadsheet for a client, whose payroll records were an absolute catastrophe, and she almost didn't answer because the column she couldn't account for, and she hated stopping in the middle of that kind for, and she hated stopping in the middle of that kind of thing. But it was her father, so she answered. Margot. He didn't use her name like that. Careful waited, unless something was wrong. I need to talk to you. She set down her coffee. Tell me. The story came out in pieces, the way bad things usually did. He'd borrowed money 18 months ago from a source she gathered was not a bank to cover a loss in a business venture he'd been too embarrassed to tell her about. He'd thought he could pay it back within 6 months. He had not paid it back within 6 months. He'd borrowed more to cover the interest on the first debt. There was now a meeting, he said, very quietly, that he'd been summoned to, and he wasn't sure what that meant, and he was scared. Who did you borrow from? She asked. A pause. A man named Cade. She sat very still. You've met him, her father said, at the Harcastle event. I saw you speaking in the corridor for about 7 minutes. He asked about you, her father said, the next morning. He called me directly, which he doesn't usually call directly, Margot. Men like him don't make their own calls, and he asked me what you did. She looked at her spreadsheet, at the column of numbers that didn't balance. What did you tell him? I told him you did contract accounting work, forensic bookkeeping sometimes, that you were very good, and? Another pause. Longer. He wants to meet with you. The address her father gave her was in the garment district, which she hadn't expected, a building that looked like a textile warehouse from the outside and revealed itself, past a lobby that had been gutted and rebuilt in concrete and matte steel, to be something else entirely. A man in a dark suit met her on the 3rd floor and walked her down a corridor without speaking and stopped outside a closed door. He's inside, the man said, and that was the full extent of the greeting. Cade was at the far end of a long table when she walked in, not sitting, standing at the window with his hands at his sides, looking down at the street below, the way she'd first seen him. He turned when she closed the door behind her. Miss Finch. She crossed the room and sat down at the table without being invited to. She'd thought about this on the subway. She'd thought about a lot of things on the subway, and she'd decided that the worst thing she could do was come into this room already small. "You can call me Margot," she said, "and I want to hear what you want from me before I decide whether to leave." He watched her for a moment. Then he pulled out the chair at the head of the table and sat down himself, unhurried, with the particular ease of a man who never needed to establish his authority because it had never seriously been in question. "Your father owes me a significant amount of money," Cade said. "He can't pay it. He's not going to be able to pay it." "I know. What you may not know is that there's a secondary problem." He folded his hands on the table. His knuckles were scarred. Not recently. Old scars, pale and settled, the kind that had long since become part of the topography of a person. "My financial director left my organization 8 weeks ago unexpectedly. There are irregularities in the accounts that I can't trace with the staff I currently have, and I need someone who can find them. You want me to do your books. I want you to find what's missing from my books. Those aren't the same thing." She looked at him. "And if I do that, my father's debt is settled. A portion of it, depending on what you find." "What portion?" He named a number. She didn't let her face do anything, but internally she ran it against what she knew of the debt, which her father had described in round numbers that she suspected were optimistic, and the number Cade named covered it and then some. "Why me?" she said. "Specifically, because you're not connected to me," he said it simply. "Anyone inside my organization could be compromised. Anyone inside my organization has an interest in what I find. You're external. Your only interest is your father's debt." "My only interest is my father," she corrected. "The debt is the mechanism." Something shifted in his face. "Barely." "Yes," he said. "That's what I mean." She looked at her hands for a moment. She thought about her father's voice on the phone, careful, and waited, the way he only sounded when something was really wrong. She thought about Vivienne at the fundraiser with her champagne glass and her casual, practiced contempt. She thought about the years of doing careful, unspectacular work in careful, unspectacular rooms, and she thought about the spreadsheet on her kitchen table with its unresolved discrepancy. She looked up. "I want access to everything," she said. "Every ledger, every account, every transaction record going back to the beginning of this fiscal year. I don't work from partial data. You'll have it. I work alone. No one stands over my shoulder. No one asks me what I've found until I'm ready to say. And I don't explain my process until I've completed it." "Agreed. And if I find something that implicates someone close to you," she said, "I'm going to tell you, regardless of who it is." He held her gaze. "That's why I'm hiring you." She stood up. "I'll start tomorrow." She was almost at the door when he said, "The dress was fine, by the way." She stopped. "At the Harcastle event," he said. He wasn't looking at her. He was looking at the table, the way he did when he was thinking about something else. "Whatever she said to you about it, it was fine." Margot stood at the door for a moment. She didn't look back. "I know," she said, and left. The first week was numbers. Just numbers, which was the part she was good at. The part that didn't require her to think about the fact that she was sitting in a windowless room in a building that belonged to a man whose organizational structure she was careful not to think about too precisely. They'd given her a small office on the 4th floor with a desk and a laptop and a locked filing cabinet, whose key was on a ring with a number on it, not a label. She'd found a coffee machine in the break room at the end of the hall, and the man who usually stood at the end of the corridor, she'd started thinking of him as the quiet one, because he never said anything, just watched. Had wordlessly produced a second mug for her on her 3rd morning without being asked. Cade came in once on the 2nd day. He stood in the doorway for a moment without knocking and said, "Everything you need?" "More or less." She didn't look up from the screen. "Your receivables system is a disaster." "I know." Whoever set it up was either incompetent or deliberately making it hard to read. A brief pause. "Probably the latter, yes," she said. "That's what I'm starting to think." He left without another word. The discrepancy she was looking for revealed itself slowly, the way they usually did. Not a single gap, but a pattern of small, consistent anomalies, each one small enough to miss on its own, all of them pointing in the same direction. She'd seen it before, in legitimate businesses. Someone patient and methodical, someone who understood that large, obvious theft got caught, and small, invisible theft sustained itself indefinitely. Someone who'd been doing this long enough to know that the system's own complexity was their best cover. She flagged the first clear instance on Thursday and worked backward from it through the weekend, ordering delivery food that she ate cold at her desk and ignoring messages from her father asking how it was going. By Sunday evening, she had most of it. She sat in the quiet office with the fluorescent light and the locked cabinet and the ring of keys, and she looked at what she'd built. 6 months of careful, patient fraud, small amounts, dozens of accounts, all of it pointing to one name that appeared in the transaction records only obliquely, only in the margins, but appeared there consistently enough that she could no longer tell herself she might be wrong. She went home, slept for 5 hours, and came back Monday morning and looked at it again to make sure. She wasn't wrong. Cade was already in the building when she arrived. She could tell by the ambient quality of the place, a slight heightening of attention in the people she passed. The quiet one at the end of the corridor, with his hands clasped and stuffed in his pockets. Something had happened, or was about to. She noted it and kept moving. She knocked on his office door. "Come in." He was at his desk, not the long table she'd first met him at. The desk was smaller and more functional, covered in documents she didn't look at directly. He looked up when she walked in, and she saw something cross his face that wasn't surprise exactly. More like recognition, the kind you feel when you've been waiting for something to arrive. "You found it," he said. "I found it." She put the summary she'd printed on his desk. She'd organized it clearly. She always organized things clearly. It was a point of professional pride, with the pattern of transactions on the left and the accountable name on the right and the dates of each instance running down the middle. 6 months. Small amounts, distributed across enough accounts that it would have taken your standard audit process another year to catch it if it ever did. Whoever it is, they know your systems. He looked at the document. He was very still. "The name on the right," she said. "I traced it through 3 intermediary accounts, so I want to be clear that it's inference as much as certainty, but the inference is strong. The pattern is consistent. I don't think I'm wrong." He said nothing for a long moment. She couldn't read his face from where she was standing. "My financial director," he said finally. "The one who left 8 weeks ago. That's the name on the right," she said. A long silence. Outside, through the single window in Cade's office, she could hear the distant sound of a delivery truck reversing on the street below, the mundane mechanical beeping of it, the world going about its business. "How much total?" he said. She told him. He didn't react to the number, but something in the set of his shoulders changed, very slightly, the way a person changes when they've confirmed something they already suspected, but had hoped might not be true. "Your father's debt is cleared," he said. He hadn't looked up from the document. "You said a portion, depending on what I found. I said a portion." He set the paper down. "I'm revising that." She looked at him. He finally looked up. "You didn't have to catch all of it," he said. "You could have found enough to satisfy the contract and stopped. Most people would have stopped." She considered telling him that stopping in the middle of a discrepancy was physically uncomfortable for her, the way some people couldn't leave a sentence unfinished, but she didn't think that was what he was actually saying. "I wasn't working for the contract," she said. "I was working for the answer." He looked at her for a long moment. Something moved behind his pale grey eyes that she couldn't name. "The answer is expensive," he said. "For me, anyway. It usually is." He nodded slowly, like someone marking a conclusion. Then he said, "Are you hungry?" Of all the things she'd expected him to say. "It's 11 in the morning," she said. "Then are you going to be hungry in an hour?" She thought about the delivery food she'd been eating cold at her desk for 4 days. "Probably. There's a place 2 blocks over." He said it the way he said most things, without inflection, without particular urgency, as though he were simply identifying a fact. Good coffee, the kind that hasn't been sitting in a pot. She looked at him. He looked back at her, steady and unhurried in his strange, patient way. "This isn't part of the arrangement," she said. No, he agreed. It isn't. She thought about her father, debt cleared, the weight of the last few months lifting off the both of them. She thought about going back to her kitchen table and her second-hand furniture apartment and the careful, unspectacular rooms where she did her careful, unspectacular work. She thought about the way Cade had said at the door of the Harcastle hotel corridor that the dress was fine, not you looked nice or don't let her get to you, just, it was fine, said to a wall, almost, said like a man who wasn't used to saying the soft thing and was working around it at an angle. She reached down and picked up her bag. 1 hour, she said, and I want to see the menu before I sit down. He stood up from the desk. He was almost a full foot taller than her, and for a moment she was aware of that in the small office in a way she hadn't been at the window of the Harcastle hotel. He reached past her to get his jacket from the hook by the door, and his sleeve came within an inch of her shoulder, and neither of them moved away from it. The coffee is good, he said again, quieter, more to himself than to her. They walked out of the building together. On the street, the day had the sharp, bright quality of early autumn, the kind of day that makes the city look like it was built yesterday and might last forever. Cade walked slightly to her left, just enough that he was between her and the traffic the way, she thought. Someone does when they've stopped thinking about it and started doing it automatically. She didn't comment on it. The place was 2 blocks over, exactly where he'd said, a narrow restaurant with a handwritten menu on a chalkboard and a coffee machine that looked older than Margot and sounded like it. The woman behind the counter looked at Cade and then at Margot and then back at Cade without saying anything, and brought him coffee without being asked. They sat across from each other. You said your financial director left unexpectedly, Margot said. Did you know why at the time? I suspected. He turned his coffee cup once, the way she'd noticed he did when he was thinking. I didn't have evidence. You do now. Yes, she looked at her coffee. It was, in fact, very good. She was unreasonably irritated by how good it was, because it felt like a point in his favor that she hadn't given him permission to score. What happens next? She said. It wasn't exactly a question. He looked at her across the table. To your father, nothing. The debt is cleared. That's final, and to the person in the ledger a beat. That's not your concern. I know it isn't, she said. I wasn't asking as a concern. I was asking because I like to know the full arc of a thing, the whole sequence, beginning to end. He studied her for a moment. It ends with the money recovered and the person responsible. A brief pause, no longer in a position to do this again. She decided to accept that. It was more than she'd probably get from most. And your account, she said. Going forward, he said carefully. They'll need someone external, someone not connected to the organization. Someone who finds the full answer rather than the comfortable one. She looked at him. He looked back. That's a different arrangement than the one we had, she said. Yes, I'd need to know what I was looking at. Not the operations. The finances, yes, but not. Yes, he said. That's what I mean. She picked up her coffee cup. Outside the window, a woman walked by with a stroller and a large dog on a leash, and a cab swerved around a delivery bike, and the city continued its indifferent, brilliant machinery in every direction. I'd need full access, she said. Same terms as before. Same terms. And I don't explain my process until I'm done. I remember. She set the cup down. She looked at this man across the table, the old scars on his hands and the new ones she couldn't see, the pale grey eyes that registered without reacting, the careful stillness of him that she'd been trying to name since a corridor at the Harcastle hotel and still couldn't quite. I'll think about it, she said. The corner of his mouth moved, not quite a smile, but something in that territory. The same something she'd seen in the corridor, the night she'd been 3 kinds of wrong and walked in anyway. I'll be here, he said.